I'm going to talk today on this topic of epistemic risk paternalism. Let me say two things before I start. First, I was preparing to talk last night, my slides anyway, and my wife looked over my shoulder and said, "Steve, I thought you were talking to a philosopher of science at the LSE." And I kind of know what she means. I'm not certain what this talk is. I'm not certain this talk is in philosophy of science, in moral philosophy. It's a discipline in between which as yet doesn't quite exist. So I apologise for that. Second, all of my examples are about lung cancer screening, which is a very depressing topic, so I apologise for that too. They say you should never start a talk with an apology, but I've given you two apologies, and two wrongs make it right, as Kant didn't say. Okay, so my topic is epistemic risk paternalism. And to start, I just want to give you three kind of examples, three real-life examples for tied up philosophical purposes. The first is a case of George VI. This is the funeral of George VI. So George VI died in 1958, and he died effectively of complications from lung cancer. He'd been severely ill for quite some time beforehand. His doctors knew he had late-stage lung cancer, but they didn't tell him. They thought it would just upset him too much to know, so in true 1950s kind of paternalist doctor style, they kept quiet. I take it that's an instance, I've already said it, sorry. I take it that's an instance of paternalism, an instance of medical paternalism, and I take it looks prima facie problematic. There's some sense in which hiding this information on the basis it would be in George's own best interests is somehow ethically troubling or wrong. Of course, it's a slightly funny sense of paternalism, because it's not quite the normal sense where I interfere with your actions. It's like I snatch away the wine glass. But it seems to have like some kind of similarity. So call that communicative paternalism. That seems problematic. Here's my second case. The second case are two images of cancerous cells in the breast. Here's the problem. A very large number of women, when they get tested for breast cancer, we discover very small cancerous growths. These are traditionally called ductal carcinomas in situ. A very low percentage of ductal carcinomas in situ go on to become full-blown breast cancer. Yeah. However, what tends to happen is that when you tell people, you tell women, in this case, if they have a carcinoma, they tend to get very worried, and they often tend to opt for very invasive, dangerous treatment. Here is a proposal which has been made in the literature, but we change the name of ductal carcinomas in situ. We change them to call them indolent lesions of epithelial origin or idols. What's going on in this case? Well, this looks like a case where what you're doing, on one understanding, is an instance of what some philosophers, Ashram V, for example, call epistemic paternalism. You are controlling the flow of information from expert to non-expert, in this case from expert to patient. But what you're doing there is you are, as it were, trying to aid the patient's epistemic well-being. What you want is you want to get them to understand that this is a growth, this is some kind of growth in their body, but it's an indolent growth. But the mere fact that it's cancerous doesn't mean it's going to turn out to be deadly. Now, epistemic paternalism is a bit controversial, but I take it that's more or less okay? I mean, I take it this particular case, we could debate about, but there are other cases where people control the flow of information from a non-expert's epistemic well-being, which I take it look absolutely fine. Yeah? If you don't think that, just think about when a teacher is at school, and the teacher doesn't just say to the kids, "Hey kids, here's all the facts in the world." The teacher curates what she says. The teacher somehow kind of controls the flow of information. So that's epistemic paternalism. Lots of tricky issues around epistemic paternalism, but prima facie it's okay. Here's my third case. This is a mobile CT scanner. This is a new NHS initiative. It's very taken from a press release from the NHS initiative. This is how the NHS initiative works. These scanners contain these vans contain CT scanners, which can take an image of the lungs. That image of the lungs can then be used to diagnose early-stage lung cancer. The hope is if you catch lung cancer at an early stage, then you will save more lives overall. So the trouble is very few people turn up for lung cancer screening. So they put the scanner in a van and they take it to a supermarket, car park, in areas of social deprivation. For some people, this is a paradigm case of what the NHS should be doing, going out into the community. For some people, it's a very worrying example of the kind of medicalisation of everyday life. You go to Asda to do your shopping, and suddenly you're told you've got lung cancer, kind of moment. What I'm interested in is what happens inside these vans. Now, what happens is very complicated, but very roughly, when you take an image of a lung, what you have then is an image, and what the radiologist has to decide, to simplify hugely, is whether that image is an image of a cancerous lesion. There are various other things it could be. It could just be a shadow thrown up from the imaging. CT imaging is very hard to do. Yeah? It could be some kind of growth, some kind of nodule which isn't cancerous. Yeah? It often happens, calcification in the lungs and so on. It's not obvious. Yeah? When you look at a CT scan, it is not as if there are little bits which say cancer, and little bits which say not cancer. So, when the radiologist interprets this image, she has to make she runs a kind of epistemic risk. There's a risk for false positive, of saying there's a cancerous growth when in fact there isn't. There's a risk for false negative, of failing to say there's a cancerous growth when in fact there is. But she has to balance those two kinds of risks in interpreting the evidence. Here's the kind of case I'm interested in. There are ways in which this happens. But also we have evidence from patient surveys that often the ways in which radiologists do this, the ways in which they balance those risks, don't necessarily track the ways in which patients would want those risks to be traded off. Okay? So I want you to imagine this case. Imagine a radiologist who knows this. Imagine I go into a van and I say, you know what, I'm worried about false positive in this case. It's a very simplified example. I'll come back to why in a second. I go out and say, I'm really worried about false positives in this case. Please, yeah, I really don't care so much about false negatives. The radiologist thinks, Steve, you don't know what's best for you. Yeah? You just don't know how bad cancer is. You just don't know the kind of harms which can happen if this goes on to develop full-blown lung cancer. I hear what you say, but I'm setting my trade-off somewhere else. What's going on in that case? That's going to be a case of what I call epistemic risk paternalism. Okay? So what we have communicative paternalism, which I take it to be prima facie problematic. That's a Georgia 6 example. We have epistemic paternalism. I take epistemic paternalism to be prima facie permissible. I actually take epistemic paternalism to be admirable. Yeah? I think the doctors who are changing the names of those lesions to kind of help people understand better what's going on in the communicative process, they're doing something good. What about epistemic risk paternalism? Is it good or bad? That's the kind of setup for the talk. I'm going to go through reasons to think it's problematic, and then I'm going to go through reasons to think that paternalism isn't the interesting topic here at all. Paternalism is like it's like a gateway drug. Okay, it's meant to get you into this topic, and then just as after the first few hits, you go to the mundane regularity of drug addiction, and you have to go through all the boring stuff. Then you have all the boring stuff. So that's the way the talk is going to be structured. Okay, and why do I think this is important? Well, I think, as I got to explain, epistemic risk paternalism is an instance of what I call epistemic risk misalignment, and I think epistemic risk misalignments are everywhere, and we lack a decent first-order theory of how to think about them. What I mean is they raise normative problems somewhere between ethics and epistemology, and while there's lots of discussion of those problems, I think we need some kind of integrated approach. Second, I think there's a link here to debates over the nature of expertise. I mean, the easiest way to see this is just, I go to my doctor, yeah? I've already said, I want my doctor to do various things for me. I want her to be an epistemic paternalist in various ways. I don't want my doctor to just throw information at me. I want her to tailor the communication to my needs and interests. On the other hand, I don't want her to be a communicative paternalist. I don't want her to hide stuff from me just for my own benefit. Where does epistemic risk paternalism fit into the notion of expertise? Here's a final thing which is going on here. As many of you will know, there is debate about the proper place of non-epistemic values in science. I don't understand that debate, okay? I feel like I've been working on it and reading about it and teaching about it for about 10 years. I don't have a clue what's going on anymore. Not a clue. Okay? What's interesting is I think that we can take some bits and pieces of that debate, use it to think through this real-life case, and it might help us go back to our debate eventually. Okay? So those are the payoffs, as it were, for going through. So that's how the talk's going to be structured. First, like I said, I'll talk about paternalism. Then I'll suggest a real issue is misalignment and give you a taxonomy. That's a boring part, as it were. Then I'll try to give you some applications of this approach, and then I'll go back to those implications I just discussed, to the so what, question. So paternalism and misalignment. Like I said, there's this large literature on the proper role of non-epistemic values in science. And in that debate, very popular argument is this argument which seems to be developed by Richard Rudner and redeveloped by Heather Douglas. If this argument is exactly Rudner's own argument or Douglas's own argument, I don't really care. Okay? But this is roughly one form of the argument. Claim 1, premise 1, scientists accept or reject claims. Premise 2, in accepting and rejecting claims, they always run risks of error, accepting claims which are in fact false, or rejecting claims which are in fact true. Let's call those epistemic risks. Normally they're called inductive risks. I'll come back to this later. Often it's impossible to minimize both of those sorts of risks simultaneously. Premise 4, a very important premise, the only responsible way to decide how to balance those risks is through consideration of the non-epistemic costs of different sorts of error. Therefore, science is, must be, ought to be value-free. The modality there is deliberately ambiguous because I think in all the arguments, those modalities are often squished together in various ways. Very hard to see if people are describing something which they think is happening, or if they're telling us something they believe ought to happen. Is that a good argument? I don't know. Like I said, I give it up on understanding if it's a good argument or not. Here's what I think is interesting. Tweak various of the premises. Tweak various things here, and then you get something much more interesting. So, here's a claim. Scientists make claims. Scientists make claims about the way the world is. When scientists make those claims, they run certain risks of error, and therefore there's some way in which they're solving those problems. Okay? Second set of concerns, there are audiences to claims, and when audiences themselves accept claims, when they decide to act as if they believe a claim, then they too run a certain sort of epistemic risks. And the way in which the audience decides her willingness to run certain sorts of epistemic risks should be sensitive, or is properly sensitive to her non-epistemic values. So very roughly, maybe if I I highly disvalue getting caught in the rain, then maybe on the basis of very weak evidence, I'll accept the claim it will rain later, I'll take an umbrella to work. Whereas my friend, who really likes being caught in the rain, maybe will require a much higher standard of evidence before accepting that claim. Whatever. Now note what's going on there. Forget what scientists do in terms of what goes on in their head. Just focus on the fact that they assert claims. And when they assert claims or make claims, strictly might not be assertion. Want to include what's implied as well as what is said. But we can come back to it. When scientists make the claims, they will be implicitly solving an epistemic risk issue. If so, then we get epistemic risk paternalism. We get the situation I described in the kind of lung cancer screening case. So here's a kind of slightly fiddly definition. An expert engages in epistemic risk paternalism if, when deciding whether or not to assert some bald statement. What I mean by bald statement is a statement which isn't given an explicit epistemic qualifier. Yeah? We'll come back to this later. But which makes a bald statement. Here's our example. You have cancer. You have a cancer growing in you. Yeah? It's a bald statement. There she balances epistemic risks in a way in which she knows her audience would not balance those risks in deciding whether or not to accept the same claim, and strictly in the paternalism case, and she does this for the benefit of the patient, for the benefit of the non-expert. Yeah? So this is a case where the non-expert is giving you some information about the world. As in giving you some information about the world, she's running some epistemic risk, but she is balancing, so when she balances the epistemic risks she's willing to run on the basis of what she believes you should be willing to tolerate, regardless of what you do in fact tolerate. Two questions. First question, does that happen? Is it possible? Second question, if it does happen, it is possible, is it bad? Let's just focus on the second question for a second. I take it it's ethically problematic. I think it's ethically problematic because it resembles communicative paternalism. It looks like you're making judgments about what's in an audience's best interests, whereas judgments are not aligned with the audience's own judgments. So this plays off the kind of paternalism CI strict. Okay? I take it that this looks to you as problematic here. I'm making some judgment about how you should trade off risks in a way which is not sensitive to how you do, in fact, trade off risks. And I'm doing so on the basis of a claim about what's in your interests, or what's in your prudential best interests. Those of you who know the debate about science and values will know there's a very, very simple response to the Douglas-Rudner argument, which looks like it's going to apply in this case. So, there's a response to Rudner by Richard Jeffrey, there's a response to Heather Douglas by Gregor Betts, and this is what they basically say. They say, scientists, you don't need to put values in science because you don't need to make judgments. What they mean is, that the scientist doesn't or shouldn't accept claims at all, according to Jeffrey. Instead, the scientist should report the evidential probability of a claim conditional on the evidence. So, the rough thought is, instead of saying, you have cancer, it's like, the rough thought in Jeffrey is about what the scientist accepts. We'll come back to this, it's important. That is a very subtle shift. He talks about assertion. He says the scientist shouldn't assert bold claims. His example here is precisely the case of the IPCC and all those epistemic qualifiers. It is highly likely that anthropogenic climate change will lead to problems, blah, 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 blah. What goes on when you do that? Well, according to Jeffrey and to Betts, you avoid running epistemic risks at all. Yeah? Because you don't, as it were, stick your neck out. You just stay inside the confines of your evidence. There's no risk of a false positive or risk of a false negative if you don't go beyond the evidence. And you might think there's going to be a very clear application to our case. Yeah? Doctors don't say to the patient, you have cancer. Say, it is, given our evidence, X% likely that you have cancer. Then you avoid the problem. Why do I think that doesn't work? First, I think there's a worry that this is just not feasible. Yeah? Let me just take you through what goes on in actual cancer screening. You have serious questions. Is this image in front of me a growth or a shadow? Beyond that, there are various kind of inferences you have to make which go on to deciding how likely it is it's cancerous. You have to know how large it is. You have to know its volume. Measuring the size and volume of tumours you detect on scans is not at all easy. All sorts of worries, you're getting the measurement a bit too long, a bit too short, you're miscalculating the volume. How many growths of that size are benign? What is exactly the possibility, what's the probability given the frequency of cases of this going on to become cancerous? What does epidemiology say? What are my Bayesian background priors here about people in this situation? How certain are we in that epidemiology? What's going on, I take it, is that in this kind of case, I've got a longer version of this paper which goes through the actual decision procedure in much more detail. But trust me for now, for the time being, we can talk about it. What about have time to talk about it now, like that? There's a lot of decisions you make in interpreting an image. Yeah? And I take it that what happens is, if you just end up saying a number, then often what's going on is you're hiding various epistemic risk decisions you've made along the way. Yeah? In fact, you already decided, yeah, that's 2 centimeters or 1.9 centimeters or whatever. You made that as an on-off decision, and then you hide it by making a positional on which you will be 2 centimeters. You might disagree. You might think, no, it's possible. It's possible. It's difficult, but it's possible. Do you know what? I think even if it's possible, it's just not desirable. Yeah? Here's what's not desirable. When I go, I mean, I haven't been screened for lung cancer, but were I to get screened for lung cancer, yeah? What would I want the doctor to tell me? I would want the doctor to tell me, Steve, you've got lung cancer, or you don't have lung cancer. The more information the doctor gives me about all this stuff, the less useful it is for me to go to the doctor. Yeah? Here's what the doctor can do. The doctor can say, Steve, here is your conditional probability given this particular study. However, there was a later study, published a few years later, and your conditional probability based on that is this. However, we need to take account of the fact that there's often interrater variability between radiologists and radiographers, given their background training. Given that, I think you should also discount my probability by this. Yeah? You might be getting that. Yeah? I'm not. And I spend a lot of time thinking about this kind of issue. Yeah? When I go to the doctor, I want the doctor to be making judgments. This goes back to the epistemic risk, sorry, straightforward epistemic paternalism case. Yeah? When experts communicate to us, what we want the experts to do is, as it were, to cut out lots of stuff to get us to the situation we need to be in. I take it that what's going on here then is that the problem isn't about judgment. The problem is not that the radiologist is making some kind of epistemic leap. Yeah? The problem is that because they have to make epistemic leaps, arguably, and it's really good that they make epistemic leaps. That's what we want them to be doing. The problem is that the epistemic leap is misaligned with a non-expert's values. Yeah? That's what I take is really worrying in the epistemic risk paternalism case. So, that's an account of epistemic risk paternalism. Note some nice features of this account. It helps us understand the relationship between epistemic risk paternalism and communicative paternalism. So I take it what's going on in communicative paternalism is very often, of course, your doctor doesn't tell you various things. Yeah? The doctor doesn't have to tell you everything. Is that paternalistic? No. It's not paternal. It only becomes paternalistic when the things the doctor isn't telling you are things which you would want to know. Yeah? Consider this case. I go to a doctor, the doctor says, Steve, you've got to have an operation. Here are various facts about the operation. And then as I'm about to have the operation, I say to the doctor, the scalpel handle, it's green. And he says, yes, the scalpel handle is green. I said, you didn't tell me that. That doesn't look like there's been a failure by the doctor to communicate anything, unless and until it turns out he should have known I have a phobia about the colour green. Yeah? The doctor makes a reasonable assumption. Most people don't care what colour the scalpel handle is. And leaving that out, that's good communication. He's made a judgment in some sense. Don't mention this fact. That judgment is justified because it's aligned with my values. Similarly, I take it in the epistemic paternalism case. What's important there is that we improve people's well-being by aligning to what they're interested and care about, their epistemic kind of limitations. And the epistemic risk paternalism case, again, making the judgments is fine, but worry is about the lack of alignment to the values. Here's the next part. Here's where it goes from paternalism to more boring stuff. Let's go back to that debate, that Douglas debate, which is in the background. The Jeffrey Betts response we've already discussed. Scientists keep clean hands by avoiding running epistemic risks at all. They don't make judgments. They just said, well, that's a bad response. We want them to make judgments. But there's a different response to that argument. This is a response which is initially made by Isaac Levy, and I think Torsten Wilholt makes a similar response in a slightly trickier way recently. This goes, look, scientists run epistemic risks, but they keep clean hands. They don't make moral judgments. They don't have to make moral judgments, because when they run epistemic risks, what they do is guided by various methodological conventions. Yeah? The scientist plus scientist makes these decisions based on the conventions of the scientific community. Is that a good response to debate over whether science must be value-laden? I don't know. Again, here's what I know. It's completely irrelevant in our case. Because we get epistemic risk misalignments, whatever the expert is doing. Think about it this way. An epistemic risk misalignment is a case where, when deciding whether or not to assert some bold statement, some expert implicitly balances epistemic risks in a way which our audience would not balance those risks in deciding whether or not to accept the same claim. Whether the expert is aware of that, whether the expert intends to do that, whether the expert is motivated by a concern for the subject's own subject's own prudential well-being, is just irrelevant. there's a misalignment. How do misalignments happen? Here's one kind of case. It's a case I've discussed before in various places, but nobody ever read it, so I'm bringing it here. One case is what I call wishful speaking. Wishful speaking occurs when an expert balances epistemic risks in a way in which her audience would not, because the expert wants the audience to accept the claims regardless of their truth. Let me give you an example of this in the cancer screening case. It's a book by Margaret McCarthy, some of you will come across. She's very kind of skeptical of screening programs in the UK. There are a very small group of people here who might be interested in the philosophy of cancer screening. Be very careful because most literature on this topic comes from the States, which has such a weird healthcare system. It's not applicable to the rest of the world. But in the UK case, this is really interesting. Okay? What McCarthy says in that book is, in effect, you want to be really careful because there's lots of people involved in screening who have some kind of vested interest in finding cancers. Yeah? Here's one way of understanding that. There's a notion in the literature on values and science of so-called micro-inductive risks, of the very small little decisions you make throughout the process of research, where each time you could, as it were, take that risk in a way which ever so slightly changes your chances of getting to the end result, and then they accumulate. So think about a case where you're doing screening. Is it a shadow or is it actually a nodule? I go for nodule. Is a nodule 1.4 centimetres or 1.5 centimetres? I go for 1.5 centimetres. There's a sense in what you have in that set of decisions is many, many, many micro decisions. The notion that I take is that each micro decision is driven by a desire to get to a particular result. Note something important here, though. Sometimes this is framed in terms of motivated reasoning, very much the way McCarthy frames it. That seems very weird to me. It makes it look a little bit as if doctors want people to have cancer. Yeah? As if, they really want to believe that, and then they reason that way. I'm not saying anyone wants that to be the case. What I think is much more important is they want to be in a position where they can say that to people, and where people believe it. That's why it's wishful speaking, not wishful thinking. I think wishful thinking is a very peculiar phenomenon. But the notion of saying stuff, it's far easier to understand the mechanisms. Is that the same as epistemic risk paternalism? No. Because in the paternalist case, what you're doing is you're balancing, you've got a misaligned set of epistemic risks where you're overruling, as it were, the patient's judgment about what's in her best interests. Here you just don't care about the patient. You just care about getting a particular result. Yeah? You're not overruling her for her own benefit. You're overruling her for some further end. I think that happens in the cancer case. Well, I don't know if that does happen in the cancer case. I think it could happen in the cancer case. It simply seems to happen in other cases. Biomedical testing would be the key example. Second source of misalignment. This is these are what I call spandrels of certainty. I know it's not really a spandrel. Okay? I just really like the phrase. I'm really sorry. It's really childish. But I was really delighted to hit across this phrase. What I mean here, though, is just a case, and I take it this is actually the case which Levi Wilholt response from the beginning is really getting me to. It's just a way in which the experts do stuff. And the way in which the experts do stuff is they balance epistemic risks this particular way. And that particular way in which they balance epistemic risks, for whatever reason, which might just be historically contingent or whatever, just misaligns with the audience. I think the easiest way to see that is when you think about cases of things like AI diagnosis. So we can now have various image recognition software tools which in effect diagnose patients as having cancer or not. Those tools are trained up using expert radiologists' decisions as input. What's going on when that happens is, it seems to me, that you have a system which is put in place which balances false positives, false negatives in a particular way. Yeah? It balances it in a way in which an exemplary member of a community of radiologists would. When you then use that AI tool to diagnose a patient, there's no sense, it seems to me, in which the patient's judgments are being overruled or not. What's going on is just misalignment. Case 3, role-specific obligations. This is a source of misalignment I find most interesting and hardest to get my head around. Let me just try to explain what's going on by means of an example here. In debates over screening, a distinction is often made between two levels of safety and efficacy a screening test can have. Okay? One level is it's good enough to be made available for people to test themselves at home if they want to, using their own money. The other level is it's effective and safe enough to be used as part of a mass screening program. And roughly, you require a lot more evidence, particularly you require a lot more evidence for positive cost-benefit trade-off from making it part of a screening program than you do for allowing people to use it at home. What's going on there? Well, here's one way. This is very much something people involved sort of say, and it requires a lot of philosophical work to tease apart what's at the back of their heads. Here's what they say. They say, look, if people want to run those risks themselves, then who are we to stop them? Yeah? People want to take a test at home, which is like a really quite a bad test. Fine. But when we put a test in a screening program, we are vouching for it. And specifically, when we invite people to screening, we are responsible for the harms which follow. And because, in the case where because we are responsible for the harms which follow, and we are doctors, we are bound by various duties to do no harm. And so, here's what happens. The argument goes something like, if you want, in your own home, to use this slightly, shonky test, that's your choice. We respect your autonomy. But we won't give that test to you because we don't want to harm you or be involved in harming you, potentially. Spelling this out is really hard, and it's way beyond anything I've tried to figure out so far, which is why in the middle of this talk, hidden away. But I take it what's really interestingly going on here is the way in which our obligations are affecting our standards of certainty. And note something really weird. Typically, debates around the ways in which moral ethical considerations feed into changing standards of certainty is done via broadly consequentialist considerations. Here, of course, it's not consequentialist. It's something about different duties of different people involved, which is affecting the epistemic standards. What that means, however, is you can have weird cases. You can have cases where, as it were, the patient is really willing to have a subset of tests, let's say for lung cancer. They're willing to run those epistemic risks, and the doctor just won't give it to them. The doctor's refusing to use that test, they're only going to use the other test. Again, you get an epistemic risk misalignment. Here's the problem. Epistemic risk alignments seem bad for non-experts, regardless of how they come about. It seems kind of bad to me that if I'm relying on an expert, that the expert is telling me things which, were I fully informed and somehow able to do all this stuff myself and balance epistemic risks the way I want to balance them, I wouldn't accept that claim. That looks bad to me. It's not the worst thing which could happen to me, but still, it's not the best thing which could happen to me. On the other hand, different sources of risk misalignment differ ethically. I think there's a big difference between the case where the doctor knows what your trade-off is, and she just says, well, you know what? You're just incapable of reasoning about what's in your own best interest. I'm going to ignore your risk trade-off. That's different from the case where the doctor says, look, I understand that's a trade-off you're going to take, but I've got an ethical duty, which means I'm just not going to take that risk myself. I keep my hands clean here. That's different from the case where the doctor doesn't have a clue about yours, and they're just doing what the doctor does. This is what I learned in medical school. They seem to differ ethically. Also, interestingly, they seem to demand different and perhaps contradictory responses. If you really want to stop a kind of paternalism case, a case where the doctor keeps on overriding you, then here's one way to do it. You standardize. You hand it all over to the AI system. Here's a problem with the AI system. The AI system is completely insensitive to different values, and so on. Yep. What you have here is, I think, something a bit like the debates around substantive procedural objectivity. You can have, as it were, a procedural solution which avoids one set of problems here, but maybe run into problems in some cases, or you can have a non-procedural solution where, as it were, you allow for flexibility. By allowing for flexibility solves some problems, but creates risks and other problems. What should we do here? Don't worry about paternalism as the first key lesson. Instead, worry about justifiability. So here's what I want to say. Here's my, I said there's no first order theory. Here's my, it's not really a first order theory because it's not a theory. It's just a long summary of what I've said so far. Okay? Epistemic risk misalignments are prima facie epically problematic, but permissible if one, they're an instance of justified paternalism. Paternalism can be fun in some cases. Or they're an instance of justified wishful speaking. Justified wishful speaking is harder to imagine cases of, but there might be cases. Or they're an instance where role-specific obligations differ, meaning the doctor is correct. She shouldn't be offering you that test. Or they arise as a result of a social epistemic system which is in general optimal. I think 4 is the hardest one, but this is the kind of case where, maybe the AI system isn't aligned to your particular set of trade-offs. But there's no way to make some system for doing these trade-offs which is aligned to, without creating other kinds of problems elsewhere. It's just justified in general. And I think that this, I say this isn't a theory, of course it's not a theory, it's just a suggestion. We need something like this, and maybe that goes on, ... Here's an obvious question. I just said epistemic risk alignments are kind of bad for people. And I've assumed that because they're bad for people, we require an account of how they can be justified. But of course, all sorts of stuff is bad, but it doesn't mean it has to be justified. Quite why epistemic risk misalignments require justification at all, I don't know. If somebody really wanted to say that I'm just, making up something out of the middle of nowhere, this is where I'd attack myself. Yeah? So this is one of those clever things where you say something in the Q&A, I go, haha, this is a big problem. Yeah? I don't know. I think it might be something about the ethics of speech. I think it might be something that when I make some claim, I implicitly suggest that somehow there's some kind of Gricean thing going on here. I implicitly suggest it is somehow relevant to you. It's not really captured by any of the Gricean norms. Maybe it's something about the ethics of expertise in particular. Maybe it's something about the asymmetric relationships between individuals which generate some need to justify the misalignment in general. I'm not certain. Is any of this any use further? This is slightly out of order from your handout, sorry, I fiddled around a bit last time. Yes. Here's one case. Just to promise you it's not all about screening. Consider the glyphosate rules. So glyphosate laws, and you know glyphosate is a weed killer, which you routinely use it in your garden at home or whatever if you have a garden. But there's recurrent worries that glyphosate causes cancer. Does glyphosate cause cancer? The evidence is inconclusive, okay? We have various expert bodies. Some recommend that glyphosate doesn't cause cancer. IARC, the International Association for Research on Cancer, suggests it's possibly carcinogenic to humans, whatever that might mean, and so on. Various national governments have nonetheless placed significant limitations on the use of glyphosate. So, for example, in Portugal, you can't use glyphosate in public parks. What's going on there? Well, I take it that this is just a simple case of an epistemic risk misalignment. Yeah? What the Portuguese government is saying is, sure, the evidence may not be good enough for the scientists to say glyphosate causes cancer, but it's good enough for us, the Portuguese government, to ban glyphosate. And if I'm right, that should happen all the time. Yeah? Here's the interesting question. Is it problematic that the scientists won't say it causes cancer? Let's just assume that the Portuguese government is correct about its values and its trade-offs. Yeah? Is it problematic that this is where the Portuguese government can't just rely on the scientists? Well, then I think we've got a substantive question about what's justifiable here. Because on the one hand, if the scientists were to be, as it were, more flexible in their willingness to describe glyphosate as causing cancer, then that would be useful for the Portuguese government, in the sense that it would kind of strengthen the case for regulation, but it would also be problematic from a viewpoint of our governments, which trade off in different ways to the Portuguese government. The question here, the issue here is, we have an epistemic risk misalignment. The question is not, do we have them? We do. The question is, can it be justified? Is there an argument for changing scientific practice in a way which would somehow lessen those misalignments? I don't know. I think that's exactly where the kind of overarching structure here of the kind of theory we need. Here's a second case. So some of you know this photo. This is from the 80s, when sorry, the very early days of HIV/AIDS, when various people who had HIV/AIDS demanded that various experimental treatments were made available to them, and the NIH and the states refused. So the guys holding up NIH equals Nazis in healthcare. This is a very general example of a phenomenon which has now kind of been routinized in medical practice, where you have this very odd phenomenon where you have drugs which are not yet kind of past various regulatory hurdles, they're not yet allowed on the market, or they're not yet allowed on the market for a specific disease, but you can write to a pharmaceutical company and make what's called a compassionate use request. Basically, a compassionate use request goes something like this. You write to, let's say, a pharmaceutical manufacturer, and you say, look, you make a drug for treating liver cancer. We know that a drug is currently being used, there's experimental trials going on about using it to treat some other kind of cancer, which I've got. We know the experiments haven't concluded, but could you give us some of the drug for that usage? Okay? These so-called compassionate use programs, and they are there's ways of doing this in the UK, there's ways of doing this in the US, there's ways of doing this in the EU. Very standard program. They're also really puzzling programs. They're really puzzling programs for the following reason. And why is it that a pharmaceutical company has to get the drug via all of these regulatory tests, and yet is allowed to give it away to people who ask for it? Yeah? You're basically allowed to give away a drug which hasn't passed regulatory tests to someone who's ill and asks for it. I take it that this goes to this issue of differing standards and the kind of moral issues here. I take this as a case where there's someone who autonomously requests to make, so somebody who makes an autonomous request to have a drug, and we're certain they understand the epistemic risks they are running, then respect for autonomy means that we respect their choice. We give them the experimental treatment. What that leaves open, though, is why is it that in the normal case we don't do that? Why is it that we don't do this all the time? Why don't we just put the drugs out there and just say, these are the risks, you decide. I mean, some people think we should do that. There's an interesting book by Flanagan called Pharmaceutical Freedom, which argues exactly we should do that. But I think one of the reasons we don't think we should do that is partly because we think that in making the drug available generally, we are, as it were, offering, not just responding to a request. And when we offer, then those offers are guided by various kinds of ethical principles, principles of non-maleficence, principles of beneficence, and so on, which mean that we have a more stringent evidential requirement than we do when we respond to patients. Again, I take it, you want to really understand the system of drug regulation we have, you need to understand that it has these built-in epistemic standards and these exceptions to the epistemic standards which are grounded on broader deontic concerns. Finally, let me go back to my case study of screening. I've told you one tiny little bit about the cancer screening, about the kind of decision to describe the growth as cancerous or not. But here is a really big worry about screening. That's a worry that we have a so-called form of overdiagnosis. Overdiagnosis occurs when we have various criteria for describing growths as cancerous or not. And the worry is not, but, okay, I'll take this slowly, sorry, this is always a bit tricky. The cases I've described here are cases where we have, as it were, some image, and we have to say cancerous or not cancerous. And we can get that as it were right or wrong relative to some definition of what counts for a growth to be cancerous. The worry here is that our disease definition, that's the first worry we discussed already. That's an inductive, straight inductive risk worry. But worry which goes on in the overdiagnosis debates is that what counts as cancer gets stretched. The disease concept itself gets stretched. So that perfectly normal developments of the human body get described as pathological. So the worry there is that even if you were getting no false positives, no false negatives, you were perfect, you would still be describing too many people as having cancer, because you would in fact be describing healthy people as being ill, in effect. Here's what I take is interesting about that. That's not the inductive risk case. What is it though? Well, I take it it's a case where we have something like the following structure. I take it there are paradigm cases of having cancer and paradigm cases of not having cancer. But between those paradigm cases, there is, as it were, an objectively vague realm. If this matters was almost like epistemic vagueness, there's some, as it were, line drawing issue. When we draw a line in objectively vague situations, it looks like where we draw the line, exactly how we describe the boundaries of a cancer concept, should be sensitive to values. What's going on in the overdiagnosis case, I take it, is precisely an argument over which values should be driving that decision. So I take it that this notion of an epistemic risk misalignment isn't just operative in the case involving false positives, false negatives, the inductive risk case. It's operative in this kind of conceptual case as well, in the case of ontological or conceptual determination. Okay, so what? So first, I just made a few steps to discussing various issues about justifiable epistemic risk misalignments, but clearly there's loads more to say. Yeah, I need to better account of justifiability. I told you, I don't really have an argument there. I need to say a lot more about the relationship between inductive risk and epistemic risk, what exactly is going on in that cancer case. I focused on cases where scientists describe the world, but scientists make all sorts of other speech acts. So I think, for example, diagnosis. The example I've been using is really tricky. I made it sound like a diagnosis of cancer is just a description of the world, but I take this not just a description. I take it functions like a predictive, in Austin's sense. When I say, you've got cancer, I'm not just describing something, I'm moving you into your social role, and that's part of what's in the overdiagnosis debates. Scientists advise, may recommend, not at all clear what the norms for those speech acts are, and how that feeds back into what I just told you. What about expertise? Well, first, I think that notion of epistemic risk paternalism just helps us understand something which is really puzzling when you think about expertise in general. Okay? The trouble is that there is kind of communicative paternalism, which looks bad, epistemic paternalism, which looks okay, and then figuring out what the difference is between them is very hard because they shade into one another. And I would suggest what epistemic risk misalignment gets us to is a notion of misalignment, which is key here. It's not about making judgments. It's not about making guesses about what your audience cares about. It's about overruling your audience. But here's the second important payoff. I think epistemic risk misalignments just explain and sometimes justify failures to defer to acknowledged experts. So there's a standard model of expertise where if, as you were, you recognize that someone knows more about topic X than you do, and they give you an answer in the domain of X, then you should defer to their testimony about X. And I take it that if we have epistemic risk misalignment at the front of our head, we realize that that doesn't have to be the case. Yeah? I can accept that the doctor knows a lot more than I do about vaccine safety. And I might think that she is willing to say the vaccine is safe at some level. I'm not willing to accept that claim when it's my child being vaccinated. So I think there's something very interesting going on there. I think there's also a normative issue here. I think there's a relationship between epistemic risk alignment and notions of trustworthiness. I take it what it is, in a way, to be a trustworthy expert, maybe more than just that you're sincere and competent, but that you are at least, not that you are aligned, but that any lack of alignment is justifiable. So I think that's the payoff for expertise. Finally, can, should, must science be value-free? I don't know. I really don't know. Here's what I do want to say. All I try to do in this talk is I just try to switch attention from belief or acceptance of claims which is key to the original Webber argument and Douglas argument, to the assertion of claims, to making claims. And I think that when we move to assertion and communication, it's blindingly obvious, first, that scientists communicate a lot. We wouldn't be interested in them if they didn't. Yeah? In scientific Robinson Crusoe's. It's a scientific Robinson Crusoe. We're not very interested. They communicate. And we all know communication is governed by epistemic norms and ethical norms. It's obvious, yeah? If I know how to build a really cheap bomb, I shouldn't tell you how to do that. You kind of know that. So as soon as we move to communication, I take it that it's obvious scientific communication should be value sensitive. So a far better question is, how does and should the ethics of communication structure practices of justification? And I take it that that's what I'm trying to get at today, by suggesting that communication should be aligned to audiences in various ways. Then we get some interesting questions about what justifiable, justificatory practices might look like. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.